there's a certain assumption that people make when they see a person of color in a colonial costume or a costume of the past at all. And once I take the costume off, the color's still here. This story is not just about my history, it's about my life. It's about my safety.
Welcome back to Working. I'm your host, Isaac Butler.
And I'm your other host, Kristen Meinzer.
Kristen, it's been a minute. How you doing?
Oh my gosh, it is so good to see you, Isaac. Having a great summer. I love summer. It's one of my favorite times of year because I get to go visit historic sites.
Oh yeah? What are your sites on the list this summer?
This summer, I am going to Walnut Grove, Minnesota, former home of Laura Ingalls Wilder. That's right.
Incredible. Speaking of historic sites, whose voice was that we heard at the top of the show?
Oh my gosh, that is the incredible historic interpreter, Stephen Seals, who works with the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, which, yes, I have visited in summers past.
Yes, as a child growing up in Washington, D.C., I have to say I've been to Colonial Williamsburg many times, but to Busch Gardens only once. Why did you want to speak with Stephen?
Well, I am a huge fan of the kind of work Stephen does, and in fact, have even fantasized about doing it myself. I think historic interpreters do so much to humanize the past in a way that dates and wars and school textbooks never quite did for me when I was growing up. So I really look at them as people who can bring the past to life in a way that I can actually imagine or feel what day-to-day life might have been like.
Right. And for folks who've never been to a place like Colonial Williamsburg, we should say a historical interpreter is the person who kind of acts the role of the person in the time period. Sometimes it's a specific figure like George Washington or whatever. And sometimes it's like, this is what a milkmaid was like in the Middle Ages,
yes,
or something like that, right?
Yes. And I love those people who do the leather work, the ones who work in the blacksmith shop, all of them. I love watching them make the newspapers back then. But yeah, they're wearing the three-corner hats. They're wearing the, breeches that only go down to their knees, all of those things.
And do our Slate Plus members get anything extra this week?
Oh, but of course they do. Stephen and I talk about how things have shifted in the world of historical interpretation in the past 10 or 15 years, and specifically how and why we're finally seeing more people of color's stories represented. We also discuss who he'd like to interpret, who he has yet to interpret, and his answer really surprised me.
Well, that's great. If you would like that surprise and you are already subscribed to Slate Plus, it is waiting for you at the end of this week's episode. If you do not already subscribe to Slate Plus, what are you waiting for? Go to slate.com/workingplus and subscribe today. I know sometimes you think we do this pitch a lot. Like if there was a historical reenactor playing me, he would just be talking about Slate Plus all the time. But it is really great. You get full access behind the paywall at the Mothership site. You get bonus segments on shows like this one. You get to support what we do right here on Working. Go to slate.com/workingplus to sign up today. Now let's listen in to Kristen's conversation with Stephen Seals.
Get 3% daily cash back when you use Apple Card to buy a new iPhone 15 or pair of AirPods at Apple. You can choose to grow it at 4.4% annual percentage yield when you open a savings account through Apple Card. Apply for Apple Card in the Wallet app on iPhone, subject to credit approval. Savings is available to Apple Card owners subject to eligibility. Savings and Apple Card by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch. Member FDIC. Terms and more at applecard.com.
Stephen Seals, welcome to the show. We are so excited to have you here today.
Well, thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Now, first and foremost, I have to confess that as a lover of both history and performance, I am a lifelong geek for the kind of work you do. I first saw historical interpreters as a little girl in my home state of Minnesota, and since then I've seen them all over the world, including Rose Hall in Jamaica. I've been to your very own Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia.
Wow.
Did you also grow up admiring the work of historical interpreters?
No. Actually, if the honest answer is, I didn't even know it was a thing. As an actor, I did just about everything that you can think of within theater, but I didn't know that historical interpretation was a thing until I auditioned for Colonial Williamsburg, God, almost 16 years ago.
Well, if you had no idea about it, how did you end up doing this and becoming one of the most celebrated historical interpreters in America? How did that happen?
Oh, thank you for looking at me that way. It actually, it was completely by accident. I was a freelance actor, and I was at a cattle call audition in Memphis, Tennessee, of all places. The Unified Professional Theater auditions that they have every year there. And it's crazy. It's 900 or so of us actors descending on one city to audition for as many theaters as we possibly can. And it just so happened at that audition back in 2008, Colonial Williamsburg was one of the companies that was there looking for actors. And they were one of the people that called me back. And when I was looking at all of the theaters that had called me back after my audition, because you basically have 90 seconds to audition for all of them, I looked at the pay scales of all the different theaters, because as a non-union actor, you're not really getting paid much usually. Usually happy that they're going to be housing you so that you don't have to, pay to live somewhere. It really saves you a lot of money. But I saw that they were paying a living wage, and that wasn't something that you often found as a freelance non-union actor. So that made me interested immediately before I even knew what it was. And then I found out what it was, and I went, whoa, this is unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. And it was also an hour away from where I actually lived in Richmond. So it just all ended up falling into place to make sense.
Now, when you get hired to be an actor-interpreter, unlike traditional theater, it's not just that you're on a stage. You also are interpreting history. So did you have to have a history background to do this?
No. And if I'm being honest with you, I didn't look at the colonial era as a time period that had anything to offer me. As a Black man in America, I didn't see it as very important to my history. And then I get here and I find out and understand that that is completely wrong, that you can understand everything that is wrong and everything that we deal with now with race and age and gender and all of that.
And class and economics and nation building, all of it.
It's all codified in America during that colonial era. You find all the answers there.
Yeah. And did you start to develop a love for those times through doing your job? Or did you decide, you know what, I am going to just soldier through this even though I don't really love it? What happened there?
Well, it started off in that way of soldiering through. And honestly, in 16 years, my answer hasn't changed of, what time period, if you could go back to any time period and live there, what time period would you live in? Right now. Because things in the past were worse. They always were. So that answer's never changed. But it also taught me, working and doing the work that I'm doing, to love my Blackness. Growing up as a child, they would just talk about slavery, Black people in slavery and all of this. And, we don't want to talk about it, but we have to talk about it. And, when I was in school in the 80s, they were rebroadcasting the TV series Roots. And I was in elementary school. And after that, I remember all my white teachers apologizing to me for slavery. I remember being in school and being made to feel like my history was shameful, and that to talk about it was to bring me and the rest of the world down. So if my history is terrible, then that means my identity is terrible. And I did not really like my identity for most of my life. And it wasn't until actually when I started at Colonial Williamsburg, I still didn't like my identity. I got very depressed. I thought about leaving. And one of my colleagues, who, funny enough, her name is Hope, which is a perfect name for her because she's a goddess. And she said to me one day, she said, "Don't look down in shame. This is the story of our ancestors. You're giving a voice to the voiceless. You're humanizing the dehumanized. It is an honor to speak their words, or to give them the words that maybe they didn't get a chance to say at the time." you should be very proud of what you're doing, very proud of what you're representing, because our people survived that you're here today to do it. And the moment she said that to me, everything at work changed. And I knew that I was going to be here as long as they want me to be here, because the work I do it's far more far reaching than anything I've ever done in my original 14 years of freelancing and traveling as an actor.
Let's talk more about what you're doing there. You're portraying nation builder James Lafayette. Can you tell us a little bit about him and what you try to bring to your portrayal of him?
James was an enslaved spy during the Revolutionary War. He spied for the Marquis de Lafayette, who was a major general under George Washington during the Revolutionary War. And after the war, he had to work through the law in order to be able to gain his freedom, because his freedom was not necessarily given to him after the war, despite the fact that he had served the country. And then the next part of the story, or the next era of his life, is citizenship, is trying to gain citizenship, because even being a freed Black man in America in the late 18th, early 19th century, Virginia and many other states did not allow Blacks to be citizens. So you could be free, but you didn't have the equal protections that the Declaration and eventually a Constitution would give you. So you're going through life. Yes, you're your own self, but you aren't guaranteed any of those rights. And so how is he navigating the world at that point? And he's navigating it to try to free his family. And he has a wife whose name we now know as Sylvia. He had children, and he was able to free them. He's able to free numerous other family members. He gained 40 acres of land in New Kent County. He had to buy his family members, and then it looks like he owned them, which is what you had to do, because Virginia law made it very difficult even for freed Blacks to be able to free their family members. So what he had to have gone through in order to be able to be free with his wife and his children, I can't even fathom. I don't think anybody today could fathom it.
With somebody like James Lafayette, who was, as you say, Black and spent much of his life enslaved, there are going to be a lot of holes in the history, because those in charge of writing the history books don't prioritize stories like his.
Yes.
How do you fill in the holes then? Or do you?
Interestingly enough, I love it when guests ask this question, because what surprises them is that I do it the way that most of the other historical interpreters do it, whether they're doing Thomas Jefferson or George Washington or anyone who even has like a million books about them where you even know what times they went to the bathroom. There are always going to be parts within their story that you just aren't able to find. And so you make a composite character. And what that means is you take everything that you can from that actual person, and then where the holes are, you find individuals within history who have been in similar situations, and you use their situations and their stories with your understanding of that time period. For instance, the 18th century. I have to have a base knowledge of how the 18th century works, and the 18th century in Virginia specifically, so that when I look at the circumstances of these other individuals, whether they're in Virginia or not, I would know how James would have reacted based on how they would have acted within the same situation. So if I'm not sharing James's story within his story, I'm usually sharing the story of other enslaved people who were in very much the same position. So their stories are becoming James's story in some way, shape, or form. So in a lot of ways, I'm not just telling James's story, but I'm telling the story of so many other enslaved people who need their stories told, who might not be having their stories told at this point.
And what kind of preparation goes into that? Do they let you have access to certain artifacts at Colonial Williamsburg? Are you working with other researchers? Are you doing your own research?
The short answer to that is yes. We're very lucky that we have our own library, the Rockefeller Library, that has a wonderful collection of primary source documents from the time. But I'm also very lucky that Colonial Williamsburg's been around for nearly 97 years now, which means there have been historians for the last 97 years who have specifically worked towards finding as much information about the past as humanly possible. And that all gets stored. So when you come into a role, there's all of that research that's already been done. But especially with those of us that are nation builders, you really have to know how to research already. And so once you get this role, there are months that you spend just doing research. And that's very helpful. We have our historians who also have that information or help us with that information. Other museums are also very helpful. I always have to give a shout out to the Yorktown Victory Museum, because they were the individuals that made it possible for me to explore James, because they were doing the most extensive search for James Lafayette, just information that had ever been done. And also James Lafayette's descendants who are still alive today. They have a family historian, Carol, who, funny enough, lives in Saskatchewan, Canada, of all places. But I talk to her twice a year, and, back and forth with the family as well. I've gotten to meet a number of them.
And is there a playwright who's responsible for writing your character for you? Do you do your own writing? How does all of that work? I'm so curious about the behind the scenes, behind the curtain.
Well, the playwright is me, and that's the way it is for most of us who are within that nation builder unit. Part of our job is to develop our performances or our audiences or our programs. And it always has to be based off of the research. But in the end, for James, there's a certain performance that I usually do. It's pretty set, but I never scripted it. It was outlined. Right? Because you need to have it outlined, because to script it, as an actor, I prefer scripts, but for historical interpretation, scripts aren't helpful to you, because historical interpretation is predicated on the input you get from the audience. So the input from the audience then tells you what you're going to be talking about or what you're going to be saying, and you oftentimes don't really have control of that. So it's usually children. Children will usually be the ones that will ask you the most unusual questions. And they're usually good. But, well, all right. So children will usually want to understand the why much more. So they'll ask you granular questions like, what made you decide to wear red? And, it's, I remember this wasn't even when I was James Lafayette, but this was back in the day. I used to play Frederick Douglass from time to time as a freelancer. And there was a young person who asked me why Frederick Douglass, when he finally built his house, why he built it at the top of the hill of his property. And I had to, I'm not doing a script at this point, so I had to think about this. And he might have written about it, though I haven't found the specific writing about it. But societally, of course, you build things at the top of the hill. There's numerous reasons for that. There's air quality. There's being able to see things. I think mentally for Mr. Douglass, it was probably also about the fact that the people that owned him and people that tended to own people usually had their houses at the top of the hill. That to put your own house at the top of the hill is saying, I own myself and I have my own freedom. And that was probably very important to him when he finally had the ability to do so. And to be able to answer that for a child, knowing that I hadn't practiced that response, but when I thought about all of the pieces of information that I knew, that was the response that, as Frederick Douglass, would make the most sense to me.
It sounds like the questions the kids ask are some of the more interesting and fun ones.
Very much so.
We'll be back with more of Kristen's conversation with historical interpreter Stephen Seals after this.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Whether you're driving, cooking, or doing laundry, Progressive knows the podcasts you listen to go best when they're bundled with another activity, much like how their Progressive home and auto policies go best when they're bundled. Having these two policies together makes taking care of your insurance easier and could help you save too. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. That's a whole lot of savings and protection for your favorite podcast listening activities, like going on a road trip, cooking dinner, and even hitting the home gym. Yep, your home and your car are even easier to protect when you bundle your insurance together. Find your perfect combo. Get a home and car insurance quote at progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary.
Raise your hand if you are burnt out.
If email is something that gives you like a shiver in your spine.
You are not alone. I'm Shirley Leung, host of Say More from the Boston Globe. Our new series is Beating Burnout. We'll hear from Cal Newport, Krista Tippett, and more. We'll talk about breaking bad habits and forming new ones.
The cure for burnout is all of us caring for each other.
Say More from the Boston Globe. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey, listeners, it's Isaac Butler. Don't want to take up too much of your time. Just wanted to say, if you are listening to this show and you enjoy it and you don't already follow us, why not click the follow button? That way you'll never miss an episode. And if you've already done that and you're thinking, geez, what can I do to bring the glorious light of Slate's working to my fellow human beings? Well, you could rate us or you could review us wherever you get your podcasts. That sort of thing really does help us rise up through the algorithmic murk to the surface where we can be discovered by new people. Thank you in advance. And now let's get back to Kristen's conversation with Stephen Seals.
What are the biggest similarities and differences between the kind of traditional theater you used to do and the kind of performance you do now?
Ooh, the biggest difference truly is the sheer amount of information that I'm required to know to be able to do the work that I do now. As an actor, you need to know your script, you need to know your intentions, you need to know, where you're going, and then you also need to know where you came from, and then you also have to know where you're going after you're done with the scene, right? Like you have to have an understanding of all the things around that scene and everything that the circumstances of that scene, and then everything that the director intends for you to convey within that scene. When you're an historical interpreter, it widens because it's not just knowing about where you just came from or where you're going to be going. You have to know where you were born. You have to know when you were born. You have to know how that affects your view on global politics. You have to know how that affects your view on any particular subject matter that is of the time. You have to know what those subject matters of the time are. When I started working at Colonial Williamsburg, I didn't know about all these things. And I didn't know about what my daily life would have been like walking down the street in 1780s Williamsburg on a Tuesday when the lark sings at 5 a.m., right? But in order to be able to do my job as a historical interpreter, I have to understand that. And I have to know how that all connects and what that all means to the much larger story as well. So the biggest difference is the sheer volume of information that you have in your head as a historical interpreter, that as an actor, I could be a lot more compartmentalized.
When it comes to acting in the, traditional theatrical or film sorts of industries, we often hear about method acting or actors who are trying to tap into the emotional life of their characters, to feel what that character feels. Is that something that you're even able to do when you're playing somebody who actually was real? Is that something you want to do with that kind of character?
There are people, even at work now and that we've worked with before, who are able to do that, who are able to be the method. It's not something I can do. Maybe younger Stephen would have experimented with it. But what we're dealing with the degradations of what human beings are capable of doing, of owning other people and doing really, really horrible things to them. If you really think about it, honestly, to try to portray it and to try to be a part of it will break you. We had a scene about enslaved people being sold off by the American government after their owner heads off to be with the British. And we had one person in the scene who was immersive, right? In order to do it, he had to be in it. But that also meant that right after the piece, when we would finally be away from the audience, he would sob for 5 minutes to get it out of him to be okay again, right? And his performance was amazing, but I don't know that I don't know that I could do that day after day after day and be okay. I'm one of those individuals who tries to find those feelings and then learns to emulate them. Though, as a historical interpreter, sometimes as James, you do have to think like the person in order to really be able to interpret. And the way that I do that with James is that there are very specific things about James that are very different from me. For instance, James is an extrovert. I'm an extreme introvert. So when you hear James, my voice changes, my voice modulates, and James will be the first person to come up and say hi to you. And he says hi to everybody he passes. It's just what he does. It's how he was raised. So, that's when I do that, I can go right into James.
So to perform him, you don't have to be him. You just have to tap into what he's about and begin living more like his personality.
That's what works for me.
Yeah. Now, in more traditional theater, which you did for a very long time, the biggest responsibility of a performer is really just put on a good show, right?
Mm-hmm.
What would you say your biggest responsibility is as a historical interpreter?
To help people understand, to humanize their story. Just to go a little deep down the rabbit hole, I don't always feel safe as a person of color, and more specifically as a Black man who's my size, with my voice, walking down a street. Because I know, because of history and because of sort of where things started and where they are now, that it is not particularly hard for my existence to be made negative to people around me, and for people to look at me as an interloper or as an other or as someone who's not supposed to be there, right? So if I'm interpreting a story of an American who looks like me, and the people who are sitting across from me don't look like me, but they see the story as a part of their story, then maybe that helps them to see me out in the world also as them. And when you're them, it's much harder for them to make you an other. And it's really easy for people to ignore the other or to treat the other a particular way and think that they're okay to do that. So there's a part of doing this interpretation and doing this work that I do that's also about making the country safer for me or for people that look like me. So that's sort of the quiet part out loud that I don't say when I'm doing it, but I think about it every single day when I'm doing it.
Wow. That is a huge responsibility and an enormous weight. And I can't help but wonder, though, you're doing this, you're teaching humanity in a way, but what you're teaching is also a lot of painful history. How do you keep that pain from weighing on your performance and just as a human weighing on your life?
You don't. The truth of the matter is, putting on the costume and being a person of color in the costume is already heavy. There's a certain assumption that people make when they see a person of color in a colonial costume or a costume of the past at all. So that's something you cannot avoid. And once I take the costume off, the color's still here, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a certain part of the story that I don't ever get to take off. And now I wouldn't want to take it off, but I can't do that. So, it's funny at work. Years ago, there were people that would always say, no, this isn't personal. This isn't personal. And I remember when I became a manager, I always told all the people around me, never say that to me. To me, it is always personal. This story is not just about my history. It's about my life. It's about my safety. It's about my identity. I can't divorce that from the work that I do, because once I do that, then I'm really not doing authentic work, and it's just not being helpful when I do that. It's always going to be personal, and I have to be very careful. You have to be very careful, because it's my job is to be an educator, and sometimes I have to weigh my own personal biases with the education of people who need education. And, people think because you're playing an enslaved person that they can talk to you any way that they want. And I've been a historical interpreter long enough to know that even in the 18th century, if you were a random person who saw an enslaved person out on the street, you are not allowed to treat that person however you want to. They are considered an extension of the person that owns them. And if the person that owns them is important, then you treat their property in a way that lets them know that you respect that person. Therefore, there are certain things out on the street that people wouldn't have said to me within my character when I was enslaved. So I don't have to let a guest do that, but I'm also able to educate them by telling them that you don't own me, so you can't sell me. You don't own me, so you can't talk to me in this way, because the person who owns me, William Armistead, because of the way in which the system is, could take you out and have you whipped right now for what you've said to me. So you need to be respectful to everyone, and you definitely need to be respectful to the property of your betters. Right. That was not something that I knew when I started, and I was a deer in headlights when people would say things. After 16 years, I pretty much know how to answer people who maybe don't know how to come at me with things, and also try to answer them, if they're not being mean, to try to answer them in a way that doesn't shut them down, because that's the most important thing. Because once you shut someone down, education ends and you can't do your job anymore. And people don't always know that they're doing it, but they do it all the time with the things that they say and the way that they deal with things. And if you don't have a thick skin on it, you are going to react to people in ways that end that education. And it may be good for you, but it's not good for them. And maybe it's not good for society as a larger whole, and getting people to want to hear your story or hear what it is that you want to say or what you need to express.
I have to tell you, though, that everything that you put into your work as a historical interpreter does make a difference in the world. And I'm just going to share a personal story here about how your kind of work has affected me over the years. So from the time I was a little girl, I always thought, oh, maybe someday I can grow up to be a historical interpreter. But no, I can't, because I'm not white. I'm Asian. And everything depicted on Little House on the Prairie, everything depicted in my history books, everything depicted even in the historic villages I would visit, with the historic interpreters, nobody ever looked like me. And so it was just this fantasy of something that could never happen because I don't matter and I don't exist in this world. So I'm just going to keep this private dream of mine. But then PBS made a pioneer reality show that totally changed my mind about things. It featured an Asian American historical interpreter on the prairie.
Wow.
And the show explained he is not inaccurate. This is not an anomaly. This is not stunt casting. Asian Americans have been in the U.S. since the original 13 colonies.
Yes.
And it changed me in some way. That historical interpreter made me feel like I belong here. And I just want you to know that I'm sure that there are thousands of people who have met you over the years who probably felt exactly the same way I did when I saw that historical interpreter. And I'm sure some of them have told you that, haven't they?
Yeah, okay, so here's a recent thing that happened when, so I'm at the Raleigh Tavern, which is one of our main buildings that we do tours of during the winter. And I was there with two other nation builders, one of them who plays George Washington, and another one who plays George Wythe, who was the teacher to Thomas Jefferson. And we're, school groups are coming through and whatnot, and we're just having conversations with them and everything. And so I come out of the Raleigh Tavern, and our George Washington is having a conversation with a group of children, and they're mostly children of color and mostly Black. And so I go, I need to go over there and see how the conversation's going. So I walk over, and they're just having a conversation, and it's completely fine. And of course, I'm in costume, and I don't know what child said it, but one child said, James Lafayette, just very quietly, just loud enough for a couple of us to hear it. And I kind of looked over and I said, did someone say my name? And all of the children stopped talking to George Washington, perked up their heads and looked over at me. And the next thing you know, all of the children came over to me and we did a Q&A for about 15 or 20 minutes. Now, while this is happening, George Washington is standing over on the Raleigh Tavern porch, just watching it. And I'm a little worried that maybe I took away his attention or took away his interpretation. And, as an interpreter, you never want to get in other people's ways because we're all a family. We're all a part of this and we all want to help each other. So after the children left, I went up to our George Washington interpreter to, apologize for maybe coming in the middle of things. But he comes up to me first and he goes, that was the coolest thing I think I've ever experienced in my 20-some years of being here. He said, I never thought I would see the day where George Washington would get upstaged by James Lafayette. And it's wonderful. And it happened 2 more times that day. By the end of it, our George Washington and our George Wythe were actually introducing me to the children and just loving the fact that these young Black children were seeing someone who they had heard of in front of them at a museum that they could ask questions to and, be proud of. And there was one child that said to me as he was leaving, I'm going to come back when I'm older. And another child said, you're my favorite person. Right. And so it's days like that remind me of why I do this and why doing this is so important and why I have a responsibility to be an educator and to not allow my own ego, because as an actors, we have big egos, but never to allow my ego to get in the way of hopefully making things a little bit better every single day. That's what I feel like I do. And it's the honor of my life. I want to retire doing the work that I'm doing because I don't know that anything else could ever be as meaningful to me.
Stephen Seals, this has been such an amazing, emotional, illuminating conversation. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, happy to do it.
When we come back, Kristen and I will talk about having a thick skin, how historical reenactment relates to other forms of nonfiction, and how to give your audience the experience of being seen. Kristen, that was an awesome conversation. It was a job we have not covered here before. It intersects with a lot of different things we've talked about a lot, and Stephen just seems like an amazing human being, especially since his job is actually like super complex and fraught, right? I mean, just on an acting level, there's no stage, there's no script. The audience is not separate from him. He's got this direct relationship with them. The play, so to speak, is whatever that interaction is. And then on top of that, he's playing James Lafayette, a formerly enslaved person and spy for the colonies during the Revolutionary War. He's presenting history that many are unfamiliar with, and his very existence as part of the historical reenactment landscape is something some people are quite hostile to. I found the way he discussed that quite generous, actually, and really insightful. He wasn't shying away from his pain and anger about it, but he was also being very generous to, I think, the community in which he's a part. Anytime you do creative work, there's a public facing component of that. I mean, I should say my mom had a friend who was an artist and never let anyone look at the art she made, even her husband. She just drew it and then it disappeared somewhere. But for most of us, there's the moment where the work you're making is in front of the public. And particularly if you're a woman or a person of color, people are going to tell you what they think of that work, often in unkind ways. You have been doing this for a long time. You host like 6 shows. I think you said earlier today you had 10 recording sessions this week. You're putting a lot of work out there and getting a lot of feedback. You've been doing it for a long time. What have you learned about this part of the creative process?
Wow. I'll be honest with you. In the beginning, I did not have a thick skin. And it was a real relief to hear from Stephen that he didn't either. It took him years to get beyond some of the pain of the unkind feedback he'd received from people, the hostility and so on. And he, is doing something that is so challenging, as you said. He is trying to bring certain things to life that not everybody wants brought to life. A lot of people want to forget about the history that he is bringing into the world. And so he's dealing with tougher stuff than me. And so for him, I totally understand why it may have been a painful job in many ways in the early days. And for me, I appreciate that he could be so forthright about that, because I was dealing with less monumental things when I first started out. And it still hurt me when people would write in to me. They'd email me, they'd write on social media, "Oh, look at that ignorant-sounding Midwestern girl. She does not sound smart enough to be hosting a show," or "She doesn't sound articulate enough to be on an NPR podcast, and she has vocal fry, and she doesn't know what she's talking about." And it hurt at first, but over time I came to realize a lot of those comments weren't even really about the quality of my work. They were just about sexism or regionalism or a difference of opinion. And, the fact is, people are obviously allowed to disagree with me. I don't agree with everybody else, including podcasters who I enjoy and listen to all the time. I don't always agree with them, so that's okay. And it's not worth crying over, especially when I consider how many people quietly enjoy my work without commenting on it, or how many people actually have written into me over the years and have said, "Thank you for saying this thing," or "Thank you for helping me through a tough time," or just "Thank you for giving me company and making me feel less alone." And I have to remember that for all the people who complain out there, there are always going to be more who just are enjoying what you're doing, but just not saying anything about it. People love to complain more than they love to say, "I'm having a great time," right?
It is wild how much more people are motivated by writing in about things that they dislike than they are about things that they enjoy. I would say that I agree with everything you just said, except people are not actually free to disagree with me. That's the only part that's that I question. It's just, maybe they can you, but I don't know about me. But more seriously, is there specific stuff that Stephen said about that part of his process that you think about adapting for yourself in your own practice?
One thing that really jumped out at me was the way he talked about children in his audience and how they often ask the most interesting questions. And it got me to thinking about my own writing and podcasting and what questions a child might ask me about what topics I'm covering and how that might make my content feel more fresh and surprising. And so I don't even know if that's something that Stephen wanted me to take away from this, but it definitely occurred to me, like, what are the obvious questions that maybe I'm not even thinking about? Or what are the surprising questions that would add some joy to the segment that I'm working on right now?
Right. Like, why is the house on the hill? Why'd you put your house there? That I thought was really, really fascinating.
Yeah, I loved that. I loved that story he told.
Right. Whereas I'm like, you put a house on the hill. Isn't that where you put the house? Come on. Historical interpretation seems like a really particular job. On some level, there's nothing else like it. But the more I thought about it, and the more I listened to Stephen, the more I realized that it has a lot in common with other forms of nonfiction, right? You do a bunch of research, then you try to bring that research to life in a compelling and meaningful way that's still truthful, and you try to do right by the story you've come to tell. So I wonder, are there ways that Stephen looks at and frames his job that the rest of us nonfictioneers should be adopting?
I think the main thing he does is fill in the historical gaps. And with the subjects that he's covering, there are a lot of those gaps. There were not a lot of historians until recently who even thought it was worth writing about a person who was enslaved at one point. It never occurred to them to write about somebody whose ancestry is African. They just didn't want to do it. They didn't think it was worthwhile. They didn't really think it was part of the historical record in their minds. And so a lot of what Stephen is dealing with are, books with a lot of pages missing. And he's filling in those pages with something that I think is maybe even more important than dates and times and locations. He's filling in those gaps with humanity. And I just love the idea of bringing that to my own work. If, I can do as much research as I want to, but sometimes what's really going to bring things to life for people and what's really going to fill out the story best is just the humanity. And in Stephen's case, it's What is this person wearing every day when they get up? What do they eat in a typical day? How do they take care of their hygiene? You know, these tiny little things that make up a person's life, all of these day-to-day moments, they say so much more about us in the long run than signing this one treaty or being at this one location at this one time. And I love that Stephen really illuminates that through his work.
You know, I was quite moved by the story you told of finding yourself in someone else's work of historical interpretation and reenactment. It's a really good reminder to all of us who practice history that one reason we tell these stories is so that people can understand their lives in a new way by learning about what came before them. Do you think about that experience and about providing that experience for other people in your work? Like, as a podcaster, how can you give that feeling that you had in that prairie life reenactment within your own work?
Oh, well, thank you for bringing up that story. It really is something that's very near and dear to my heart. And I do try to help broaden the idea of what a woman or what an Asian American or what a Midwesterner is all of the time. And I don't try to do that through, any performance. I try to do it just by being myself. Like, I am legitimately somebody who loves visiting history villages. I am legitimately somebody who loves the Golden Girls and I've been to Golden Girls conventions. I love that. I love my Minnesota heritage, including the delicious hot dishes in Lefse that I grew up eating. And, not everyone thinks of Asian American women when they think about those things. But I think just by being myself, I'm helping people to realize I'm not that unique. I'm just another person from Minnesota who maybe is not that different from hundreds of thousands of other people from the Midwest who are also Asian American or who are also, not fitting the profile of what somebody thinks a Midwesterner or an Asian American is.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. But if you thought I was going to let you go without one last Slate Plus pitch, you were sorely mistaken. Go to slate.com/workingplus today to get bonus segments on shows like this one, full bonus episodes of shows like Decoder Ring and Slow Burn, full access behind the paywall on our mothership site, slate.com, and the ability to rest at night easily, knowing that you've done everything you can to support us. Once again, go to slate.com/workingplus today.
Special thanks to our guest this week, Stephen Seals, and to our producer, as always, Cameron Drews. Thank you, Isaac, for your great questions today. I always love talking with you. We'll be back next week, Isaac, with your conversation with documentary filmmaker Sam Green, who has pioneered a new genre of live, that's right, live documentaries. Until then, get back to work.
This is the story of the one. As a maintenance engineer, he hears things differently. To the untrained ear, everything on his shop floor might sound fine, but he can hear gears grinding or a belt slipping. So he steps in to fix the problem at hand before it gets out of hand. And he knows Grainger's got the right product he needs to get the job done, which is music to his ears. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.